Let's take a look at this GTV chart on the Bloomberg, which shows Brazil's deficit as a percentage of its GDP. We know that it surged back in 2015 and 2016. It's sort of been leveling off. So how important is getting this reining in the deficit for investors?
Right, Sherry. So Bolsonaro won today. It wasn't a surprise. But now the market is going to be focusing exactly what he does on the fiscal, and particularly on that graph that you show. There's a huge fiscal challenge for Brazil. First, in the list of homeworks that Bolsonaro and his cabinet will have is solving the pension reform. It's a necessity for Brazil to ensure sustainable growth going forward. And as we just saw in the graph, 7% of GDP in fiscal deficit will require lots of effort by Bolsonaro, his cabinet, and Congress.
Last time I spoke to Brazilian President Michel Temer, he told me that he would try to push pension reform before he left office, before January 1st. And now we're seeing the latest headlines that Temer has in fact offered Bolsonaro to push this reform. Do you expect any change before he leaves?
That would be great news. I mean, the outgoing president basically solving a big political puzzle of the incoming president, but we don't expect that necessarily to happen. The political equilibriums are very difficult. People close to Bolsonaro and Pablo Guedes, who is going to be his finance minister, have said that they don't like all of the details of Temer's pension reform. So while there's a possibility, I think it's a difficult possibility to getting it done.
So coming to today's election, we saw the Bovespa just rally 20% since mid-June, something that investors have called the Bolso rally. Does that mean that it can still continue, or a lot will hinge just how he interacts with Congress as well?
Well, I think the market was already pricing this big victory by Bolsonaro. There can still be a small rally in FX, in the equity markets, in rates, but it has been mostly priced in. Now the market is going to focus on what are the specific details of the cabinet, the specific details of the policy proposals. But the market likes Bolsonaro very much, as opposed to 40% of Brazilians that oppose him in the presidency. The markets like him because of his deregulation speech, his privatization policies, and because the pension reform, as we just discussed, is the biggest issue. He probably will want to do it first before anything else.
What happens if they can't get pension reform? Because Brazil is one of the most generous states when it comes to welfare.
It's very bad news. If you look at the microeconomics of Brazil, everything looks good. The economy is in a recovery after a very big depression. External accounts are very well, but fiscal is definitely not good. So the market will not like at all if we don't get some news on the fiscal, and particularly on the pension on the first half of 2019. It's going to be very bad news for Brazil, because debt is going to touch 80% of GDP soon, within a year or 2 years. And then those levels for an emerging market is difficult territory.
Ernesto, Brazil, along with the rest of emerging markets, have been roiled by the story of the Fed, of course, persisting on its tightening path, and some of the kind of global headwinds that have affected EMs as well. How particularly vulnerable is Brazil in that space?
Well, Brazil, not so much, except for the fiscal that we've already discussed. In terms of fundamentals, Brazil has very strong fundamentals now with the recovery going on. We expect an acceleration in Brazil from 1.4% GDP growth this year to 2.2% next year, which is a very good acceleration. External accounts are rock solid with a small current account deficit. And Brazil is financing mostly in the local markets. So in this difficult environment for emerging markets, Brazil would be okay if they solve the fiscal. And this is where all eyes will start focusing, starting now that Bolsonaro is officially the president.
He does have an uphill battle, doesn't he? I mean, in terms of the amount of resistance and division that exists within the Congress, in terms of the lack of specific detail that is given about his reform policies, and there's some concerns about the lack of experience that his finance minister has as well. Do you believe that it's all going to come together in a coherent strategy?
It's not going to be easy, for sure. Doing pension reform is difficult everywhere. And we saw in Brazil how difficult it was for President Temer, that he had lots of experience in Congress. He had the ability to put coalitions together. And now we will see about Bolsonaro, who doesn't have as a long experience as President Temer. We will see who his cabinet is. So far, the names that have been floated upon for the Ministry of Finance and for his Chief of Staff are very market-friendly and are certainly capable of doing a big pension reform. But that's why the eyes of the market will be focusing on Brazil for starting now and all of the first half of 2019 to see the advances that they are doing in terms of the politics of the pension reform.
We're looking at live pictures there of celebration, scenes of jubilance and victory and celebration in Rio de Janeiro. Of course, a short while ago, we heard from Jair Bolsonaro essentially in his victory speech saying that this government will be a defender of the Constitution, of democracy and of freedom, saying this is a promise, not from a party, not from the words of a man, it is an oath to God. It's important for him to make a declaration like that, given there are some concerns about his feelings towards democracy and certainly some of the concerns over how divisive this campaign period has been for the country, Ernesto.
For sure, that was the big concern. I mean, in a way, the market liked Bolsonaro very much because of his market-friendly policies, the turn of Brazil from the left now to the right, with the privatization agenda, with the good fiscal accounts targets that they will put upon. But the concern was his relationship with the democratic institutions in Brazil. And this victory speech was meant to calm both markets, both the people in the country. I think it was a good victory speech. But of course, same as in Mexico, when we had AMLO with a good victory speech for the markets, right now people are focusing on the details. And that's what's going to happen in Brazil, on the details of specific Bolsonaro's policies that he will try to do.
How much should we focus on the trade tensions between the U.S. and China, given that they are Brazil's two largest trading partners?
Exactly. It's difficult for Brazil. It's difficult for the rest of Latin America. But interestingly, there might be a positive aspect in the margin for Latin America, in the sense that if you got the US and China fighting and don't wanting to import from each other, then there's a space for other countries, for example, Brazil. And we've already heard anecdotes and stories of some Brazilian exporters exporting more to the US because the US doesn't want to buy as much from China. So there's an interesting channel for Latin America that we should keep watching.